In graph 13.10, we investigated how firms respond to a change in the wage rate. In the process, we found that the degree of substitutability between capital and labor has a lot to do with how these responses unfold. We'll now ask the question, how will a firm respond to a change in the rental rate on capital? The process will be a little different because capital is fixed in the short run, and therefore an increase in the rental rate does not add to the firm's costs in the short run. Thus, the firm will not change its behavior at all in the short run, and the only thing we have to analyze is what the firm will do in the long run. Suppose, for instance, that the rental rate on capital increases. If you flip back to graph 13.9, you'll see we concluded there that an increase in the rental rate will cause the firm's long-run profit-maximizing production plan to definitely contain less capital, but we couldn't tell whether it would contain more labor or less. We'll investigate this here. We'll begin again with an initial wage rate and rental rate of WA and RA that form the slopes of our isocosts, as well as a production technology in which capital and labor are relatively substitutable. The tangency of the isocost with the isoquant at point A indicates that the input bundle A is the cost-minimizing way of producing the output level XA at the current wage and rental rate. Furthermore, we're assuming that the production technology is homothetic, which implies that all other cost-minimizing bundles for producing other levels of output lie on the ray that passes through point A. Finally, we'll assume that the production plan A is in fact the profit-maximizing production plan. In other words, it is the one production plan along this ray at which the marginal revenue product of labor is equal to the current wage and the marginal revenue product of capital is equal to the current rental rate. An increase in the rental rate will cause all the slopes of the isocosts to become shallower, implying that the ray along which all the cost-minimizing input bundles lie will now be a shallower ray than before. We know from our previous work that an increase in an input price will cause the marginal cost curve in the long run to shift to the left, and this in turn causes the long-run supply curve to shift to the left, implying that for a given output price the firm will produce less. Thus the firm will end up on a lower isoquant than it started with, and a new profit-maximizing production plan might be a plan like Plan C. This plan has less capital, as predicted in graph 13.9, and a lot more labor. In panel B, we'll repeat this exercise, except now we'll assume a production technology for which capital and labor are less substitutable than they were in panel A. We again start with an initial production plan A that is both cost minimizing and profit maximizing. An increase in the rental rate will again cause the isocosts to become shallower and the firm to profit maximize on a lower isoquant than before. But now, because there's less substitutability built into the isoquants, it may be that the new profit maximizing production plan is production plan C, which again involves less capital than before as predicted in graph 13.9, but now there's no change in the labor input. In panel C, we'll do the same thing one more time, but now assume even less substitutability between capital and labor. The lower substitutability of capital and labor now implies that the new ray along which all the cost-minimizing bundles lie will be closer to the original ray, and the new profit-maximizing production plan C will involve both less capital and less labor. In essence, what happens in panel A is that when the rental rate for capital increases, the firm simply lets go of a lot of capital, and because capital and labor are so substitutable, hires labor instead. As a result, the cross-price demand curve for labor relative to the rental rate will be upward sloping. In other words, an increase in the rental rate causes an increase in labor demanded. Reducing the substitutability between capital and labor implies that it becomes more difficult for the firm to simply hire labor as it lets go of capital. At some point, the degree of substitutability will be such that as the rental rate goes up, labor demanded will be unchanged. This is what happens in panel B, and what results in a perfectly vertical cross-price labor demand curve relative to the rental rate. Finally, when capital and labor are very complementary, then the very act of letting capital go implies you're going to have to let some labor go too, because the two work together so closely. So in panel C, as we let capital go because of an increase in the rental rate, we also reduce the amount of labor, resulting in a downward sloping cross-price demand curve for labor relative to the rental rate. We can now make sense of the shaded magenta area in graph 13.9, the area labeled an increase in the rental rate. In that graph, we started with the initial profit maximizing production plan A, and we said that an increase in the rental rate will imply that the new profit maximizing production plan will lie somewhere in that magenta region. That definitely implied less capital, but it might imply less or more labor. The three panels in graph 13.11 then correspond to the cases where we have more, the same, and less labor than we did before the new profit maximizing production plan.